Big agriculture, biotech industry, another big one because it's food, right? This is everything that we put in our body. And for one of those things that we never got taught in school was that, hey, the things you eat actually affect your whole life and your health. You know, for some reason I feel like that lesson got skipped out when they were teaching us the food pyramid. It wasn't really like, you know, if you eat like shit, you're gonna live like shit later. You're gonna feel like shit later. You're gonna probably get sick. That was never taught to me, at least. I had to learn these things on my own. And when it comes to big agriculture and talking about biotech, biotech is of course biotechnology, genetically engineered food, genetically modified foods, or as the government, I don't know if you guys know this though, in the next coming years that you will not hear that term anymore. The term GMO and GE is getting erased very quickly for what they're calling bioengineered. And the reason that the government is doing that, because I don't know if you guys saw a couple years ago, during the Obama administration, they actually passed a GMO labeling bill, and it was one of the things, again, this is for the good of all you people. Instead of your city or your state deciding how or if you even want to label foods, just put the federal government in charge of it. That'll be better for everybody. And again, you got the Monsanto revolving door with the federal government, but it passed, and Trump is helping implement it. I wrote an article 2 weeks about it. According to the rules that they're putting in so far, at least 1,000 genetically engineered foods are going to be exempt from this because they don't fit the criteria for bioengineered food. So not only are they changing the language, which most people, when they see bioengineered, that's not the term that we've been promoting everywhere, right? I think it's done by design. But these companies are involved in our food. They're involved in affecting the way we live our lives. They're creating genetically engineered products. What all that typically means is that they're going in, they're splicing some part of the the genetic code of that, maybe with an animal, with something else, or they're making it resistant to certain chemicals. The most obvious example is Monsanto. Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, they have Roundup. Roundup is the most widely used herbicide, pesticide in the world. Roundup contains glyphosate. Glyphosate may or may not cause cancer, depending on which government agency you ask. And the reason I say that is over the last 4 years, there's been a scientific battle been going on. According to the US EPA, Monsanto's glyphosate does not cause cancer. According to the World Health Organization, it does cause cancer, and on and on. There's like several, people are taking their side. So there's a big scientific battle going on. People are getting paid by Monsanto and others. But according to them, this chemical does not cause any harm. But when Monsanto created it, it was seen as kind of a revolutionary thing for farmers. They could now spray this everywhere, and it would kill all the weeds, it would kill all the pests. But it worked so good, it killed the food too, right? It killed all the food. So Monsanto had the answer for that. They said, here, you can buy Roundup Ready corn, or Roundup Ready soy, and it's trademarked. It's like Roundup Ready, a little trademark there. Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soy, that works perfectly with our glyphosate Roundup poison. So that means you can plant these crops, you can spray as much poison as you want, everything else will die, but the crops will continue to grow. Of course, Mother Nature, being the beautiful, amazing, being that she is, she's learned to adapt, and so the weeds have started to come back, the bugs have started to come back, what they're calling super weeds and super bugs. And all that really means is that nature has found a way to get around this. And what's Monsanto and this industry's answer? Well, Monsanto partnered with Dow to create an even stronger pesticide that's now being used, and so it's just this cyclical thing of like, we'll use pesticides to spray this, it'll get in the soil, it'll get in the water, it might affect the plants, don't worry, it's not going to affect you, we promise. And if it stops working, we'll make an even stronger one, we'll just keep going and going on. So that's something that we've seen happening. Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow Chemical, these are the biggest genetically engineered companies out there that are making this. All three of them have revolving doors with government. If you look up a man by the name of Michael Taylor, he's probably the most known example of Monsanto, but there's so many others. When you start doing the research, Michael Taylor's just the most obvious. He was a lawyer for Monsanto in the 80s. He got appointed to the head of the USDA. They went back to Monsanto, and then Obama appointed him to the FDA, and just back and forth. And like I said, you can find Monsanto employees all through the US government. So these people are involved with the food supply, right? They put them in charge of the food supply. But as I said earlier, Monsanto, Syngenta, and Dow, they're chemical companies. These people started out making chemicals that were used as weapons of war. They create bio-warfare. That's what they first started doing. And then they got into health through the pharmaceutical industry, and now they're into the food. So think about this. You have chemical companies in control of the food and the health. Like, they are slowly getting, and energy, the oligarchy that we'll talk about in a minute. So these companies, though, are getting in power and getting control, using their friends in government to control some of the most important areas of our life, health, food, etc. But it's not just that they infiltrate the government. As I said, they're chemical companies, they use pesticides, superbugs. The other thing I want to say about the pesticides is, I believe that if every one of us in here got our blood and urine tested, we will find glyphosate, Probably another dangerous type of pesticide is called nanonicotinoids. It's a byproduct of nicotine, but it's also got some other shit in it, and some people think it's responsible for the bee colony collapse disorder that's killing a lot of the bees. But I believe if we got blood and urine tests, we would all find these pesticides in us. Maybe trace amounts, maybe some higher than others. You don't even have to live near a farm. It's just that widely used and abundant. Even if you're only shopping and only using organic, which is what I try to do, it's just everywhere. And it can be carried by the wind, it can be carried by the bees, by the birds. There was a study about a month and a half ago. Women who are exposed to glyphosate are having shorter-term pregnancies because it's doing something to them that's making them have short-term pregnancies, which obviously can cause complications with the baby. And there's so many other health effects. There's studies about affecting hookworms, affecting cranes, and I believe affecting us as well. But as they claim, it doesn't cause any harm to us. So no matter which way you look at it when it comes to this industry, you've got the poisons associated with it. Even if you think genetically modified foods are totally safe, I would say there's reason to suspect that they're not. And unfortunately, the whole thing is, how do you test a new type of food, right? You can't just test it in the lab. You have to give it to people and have people eat it for their whole lives and then see what happens to them. We are that experiment right now. We are the experiment of how people who are eating genetically engineered food will come out. And if you're eating corn and you're eating soy anywhere in the mainstream world, anywhere in like a restaurant, unless it specifically says they're not using genetically engineered, then you are absorbing this. And it's just, for our awareness, I think that we need to, again, individual personal responsibility for us to take action. And I think the answers to this are obvious: localized food production. We need to get back to that, and I'm going to emphasize that over and over and over again. I know that gardening and farming is not everybody's forte and their sort of thing. I love getting my hands and feet in the soil and growing my own food and taking it from seed and watching it, taking care of it, and bringing it in the kitchen and cooking it for friends. Like, I love that, and I know it's important. But if I can't do that, I'm at least going to go shop at the farmer's market. I'm at least going to try to support local businesses that are doing it, and I think those are steps we need to take. The other thing I want to mention related to food is the big agriculture, right? So it's not just genetically engineered foods, it's also the entire food industry, okay? The entire big agriculture. Personally, I am a vegan, but I'm not here as a militant vegan trying to convince everybody here to go that route. All I'm humbly requesting and asking is that I think each of us as intelligent, powerful human beings, if we look at the big agriculture industry objectively, we can see that it's full of violence, that it's full of, and I'm not even saying like actually killing animals, but I'm just talking about the process of you getting your meat, your dairy, your eggs, etc. Go watch some of the videos, put on the 3D glasses and feel what it feels like to go through that situation, and tell me that you don't think it's a violent act. And for me personally, as an anarchist who believes in the non-aggression principle and tries to reduce the amount of force and coercion and violence in my world, I apply it to my diet and to my food. But even if you don't want to go that far, I just humbly request that look at the source of your food, look at where it's coming from. And Whole Foods has recently been getting exposed for all their like cage-free organic farms. People are actually, hey, this is what Whole Foods little cage-free farm looks like, and it doesn't look much different than the mainstream BS that we've seen for years. I don't really like PETA and a lot of the things they're about, but they definitely have exposed a lot of this kind of stuff, as well as many other activists. So when it comes to the food, whether we're talking about genetically engineered food or just the mainstream food system, I think it's violent. It's full of violence and coercion, and even if you don't buy that, if that's not your thing, it's unsustainable. The amount of energy, time, the land that it takes to have animal agriculture, and not only that, but to say ship food from California, from Mexico, from wherever else in the world, thousands of miles across to us here in Phoenix or to Houston, that is a very, very weak, unsustainable system, and it's a weak supply chain. What happens when that food supply breaks down and those trucks don't come delivering the food? We all know what happens. Everybody starts killing themselves or killing each other or just going crazy. Unless those of us who have thought about freeing themselves and been a little bit prepared, got some food stocked up, maybe have a backyard garden, we have a support system, those are the answers to this. But whatever way you look at it, health, environmental, violence, unsustainability, there's reasons to question that system. The oligarchy, the oil industry, I just want to be brief with this because honestly, a good friend of mine, journalist James Corbett, he has a YouTube channel called The Corbett Report that some of you may be familiar with. He's pretty much covered all the bases. He has 2 documentaries out called How Big Oil Conquered the World and Why Big Oil Conquered the World that will blow your mind and show you the true depth and nature of the oil industry. All I want to say is that once again we see the name Rockefeller. Standard Oil was one of the first monopolies in the United States that was broken up in the early 1900s because they got so much power and they had to be broken up. At least that's what they claimed. But as you do the research, you realize that these institutions, the Rockefellers, the oil industry, still have massive amounts of influence and power. Not only did they work to drive out the hemp industry, along with the cotton industry, but it's just, no matter which way you look at it, it's just unsustainable. The one thing I want to say is, just like when we were talking about with Big Pharma, the oil industry, the oligarchy, they also work to suppress and push out alternative fuels, alternative energy sources. And once again, I'm not saying everybody out there that says that they have a free energy car or whatever they have is necessarily legitimate, but there are plenty of others out there. There's a reason that it took so long for the electric car to get to the United States, because the oil industry and their buddies in government have worked for generations to keep it out of the United States. It's been around for decades. We're only now getting, and even now, even though the Teslas are allowed in the U.S., they still make it very difficult. If anybody's looked into that, like, they won't allow them to have their own dealerships. They have to have like this whole other system because they don't want it to become too mass marketed, mass produced, and accepted by the people. So the oil industry and their friends in government work to suppress alternatives, because there are hydrogen fueled cars out there. There's people say that they're powering cars with water and with other kinds of stuff. Again, I don't know if I trust all of them, but if we didn't have the government and the oil industry standing in the way, we would have an open market where we could all be driving all types of different vehicles. And there's so many other alternatives out there. And the other thing is that system, whether or not you buy in, the whole climate change, if you believe in climate change or not, is kind of irrelevant to this topic. What we know is that the oil industry doesn't believe in man-made climate change. I'm skeptical myself, but despite the fact that I share that skepticism with the oil industry, what I don't share with them is their desire to push a very dangerous alternative, right? So the oil industry is not interested in getting people to reduce their amount of oil. Instead, their solution is something that's known as geoengineering. Is anybody here familiar with that term, geoengineering, or heard that? It's also just mass climate modification. If you search online, side note, I'm trying to get out of the habit of saying Google anymore, because Google is a piece of shit company that represents a lot of the things we're talking about. So if you DuckDuckGo, my name, and geoengineering, DuckDuckGo is an alternative search engine that doesn't track you. It's not quite as easy to say as Google yet, but we're working on getting more people to say that. But if you DuckDuckGo, my name, and geoengineering, you'll find plenty of articles and research if it's new to you. But geoengineering is essentially the mass, deliberate modification of the weather in order to fight climate change. It's something that's been being researched publicly for at least the last decade, and we're now at the point where here in Arizona, later this year, the first real-world experiment with geoengineering is going to be taking place with Harvard. Harvard professors are going to be launching this balloon up in the air, and they're going to be releasing all kinds of sulfates and aluminum things into the air to watch and see what happens. This is called solar radiation management. The full extension of solar radiation management is taking planes and putting them up in the air and spraying aerosols out of their exhaust. They say what it will do is it'll put these little particulates in the sky, and it'll block the sun and reflect sunlight and keep us from dying. So obviously that's a crazy idea, and every single study that I've found has said, well, we might lose blue skies, you might lower the temperature in one area and create drought in another part of the world unexpectedly. We might have mass unexpected storms, all sorts of crazy things, because at the end of the day, they're trying to play God. These scientists, and again, their friends in government, by the way, Trump and his people are very much big proponents of geoengineering. They're trying to play God, and I think that's another dangerous area of our life. So that ties into the oil industry, because the oil industry is one of the biggest funders of geoengineering. So if you haven't looked into that, please do. That's the first layer of this pyramid. Has anybody got time? I don't know right now.
It's like 9.
9? Okay, cool. I'm almost through. Thank you guys for being patient. We take a step up and we get to where there's, as I said earlier, you have the base layer, right? All those different things I just went through: media, education, pharma, oligarchy, the media, all that stuff. They influence our lives in many different ways. Typically on a regular, everyday basis. You're paying for gas every day or every other day. You come across a TV or some sort of media outlet every day or so. You have to take care of your health. All those things are daily basis. When you take a step up you get to the more concentrated power, you get things like the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is essentially an alliance between the military and the defense industry. Now, one thing I've been making clear to explain to people on this tour is that when we talk about defense industry, what is defense industry really? What does that word really mean? We're talking about war, right? We're not. It's a part of the programming for them to say the U.S. Department of Defense. Were you aware that it used to be called the Department of War? back in the 50s, before they, I guess maybe they're like, hey, maybe that's a little bit too aggressive. Let's change it to Department of Defense. Because what does defense mean? It means, oh, you're defending yourself, right? So that puts in this imagery into our minds, Department of Defense. Oh, we're just defending ourselves. Americans are just going out there to defend freedom and democracy. We're not going and aggressing on anybody. We're all the good guys. We're defending. So when you hear those terms, Department of Defense or defense industry, what they mean is war, okay? We need to be clear, because that's part of the programming. They use euphemisms so it's subtle, and like they say, torture is enhanced interrogation. Kidnapping is rendition. Like they rename things so that we don't understand the true purpose of them. So the military-industrial complex is the alliance between the military, a nation's military, and the war industry. The war industry includes the people who make the bullets, who make the guns, who make the bombs, tanks, helicopters, aircraft carriers, the lobbyists, the politicians. It's that entire complex of people who make money by sending young people around the world to die in bullshit wars over either resources or over rich people's, fights against each other. That term was popularized by General and former President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell speech. So Eisenhower served in World War II as a general, then he served in Korea, and then he became president. He truly thought that like a lot of people, thought that World War II was going to be the war to end all wars. After that we created the United Nations, and it's supposed to be, okay, we're finally going to have world peace. All the nations are coming together, we're going to figure out how to fix this out. And then what happened? Immediately, just Korean War, Vietnam War, just more and more conflicts. And up to today, we've never seen, even though they don't call it war, they don't declare war anymore, we have not seen the end of conflict since World War II. And that is because what Eisenhower saw, he saw this military-industrial complex coming up. All of a sudden, there was this huge industry that he recognized was making money off sending people to war. And he warned people that in his farewell speech. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like many people paid attention or were unable to stop it. One of the most important parts he says, and this is where he was speaking to us, to the people, he says, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of this huge industrial military machinery with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. What he's saying is only if the people are awake and pay attention can this stop. And that was 61. I mean, obviously, we didn't do a very good job. Sorry, Grandma, why didn't you help? My grandparents were trying. They were awake. But most of our grandparents or friends or adults at that time, I guess, either didn't get the message or, obviously it's kind of hard to stop a war machine. But it continues today, and I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's a huge absence of any sort of organized war movement anymore. Like, it's pretty much non-existent. The last time it was anything major was during the Bush years. And those of us, again, in the social media, independent media, have tried to rally up people like, hey, there's still torture going on, there's still wars going on, there's still bombs being dropped, being paid by your tax dollars. And, I mean, I don't know, people are kind of complacent about it now. Maybe after a while, once you're bombing 7 different countries, or your nation's bombing 7 different countries, it just kind of becomes the new normal. Like, oh yeah, bombing Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, whatever, who's next? It's sad, but it's the truth, and I'm kind of making jokes about it, but it really fucks me up inside to think about, like, that's why most of you know I stopped paying taxes, because I can't contribute to that. And I'm not like shaming anybody who does. We need to have awareness that we are paying for that. We are paying because these fools take it from us, because they steal from us.
I would love that trick. How do you do that?
We'll talk about that when the camera's off. But so, it's just really, it really saddens me, man, because like as an activist, as a journalist, as a human being in general, like it makes me sad that and I've been to. I went to the Women's March to do some reporting in January. There was recently this big gun march that happened. And if you go to these gun marches, one of the easiest things to ask these folks who are calling for more gun regulation is, how come there's nobody here talking about the military? Because the military is responsible for more violence than anybody in the world, and environmental damage as well. But yeah, so that's the military-industrial complex. One other thing I want to add to this, there was another fellow who came along shortly after Eisenhower who was warning about this military-industrial complex. His name was JFK, and he said this: "We are, as a people, opposed to secret societies. The dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers that are cited to justify them. There is a very grave danger that an announced need for an increased need for security will be seized upon by those who are anxious to expand its meaning." So he's saying, as we see now, people will step in and say, this is for your good, we need to keep you safe, give us this power to keep you safe. He says, that I do not intend to permit so long as it's in my control. And of course, he was killed shortly after that. The nonprofit industrial complex, is made up of think tanks, academic institutions, nonprofits, non-governmental institutions, all of these sort of nameless groups. They sound like, oh, the Project for the New American Century, the Center for Human Rights, like all these kind of innocuous names that actually have power. Of course, I'm not saying every single nonprofit or organization out there is a part of like some massive agenda. There's kind of this unfortunate thing that's happened on both left and right, where the right wing, anytime there's a protest, they say, oh, that was organized by George Soros, it's fake bullshit, like I don't participate in it. And the left wing says, that was organized by the Koch brothers, it's fake bullshit, yes, powerful people influence movements and they want to shape them. That's a common thing, but that doesn't mean every activist on the ground is getting a paycheck from Soros or something. But as I mentioned earlier with the education system, how the American education system became based on the Prussian model, how did that happen? It happened by the General Education Board, this nonprofit academic institution, this think tank that most people wouldn't even suspect of any wrongdoing. They're out there saying they're trying to do good things, right? But in reality, they are actually working towards their own motives. There's a really good book, and I think this was on your sheet. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, that kind of gets into this and how a lot of activists kind of get sucked into working with nonprofits, and then what they do is they kind of just, they take activist energy and just keep it in kind of a little bubble, keep them from actually challenging power. But it goes beyond that. It's not just about stifling activists' potential. These institutions, these think tanks, academic institutions, all these groups outside of government actually have power, and this continues up to the day with groups like Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, things like that, that are not conspiracies. These are powerful people meeting in private, influencing people. They work in media, they work in academia, they work in government, they work in all kinds of different fields. They come together to talk, to organize, and then they go back to their respective spheres of influence and make their objectives happen. We've known about this since the 1950s. It's just never been popularized and told to you. And again, we didn't get taught this in school. One of the most important examples, I actually didn't know about this, and I found this whenever I was doing this research. It happened in 1953. There was a congressman from eastern Tennessee by the name of Carroll Reese, and in the 50s there was all this, communist kind of Red Scare going on, right? So there was a lot of suspecting of musicians and of actors, and everybody was being accused of being a communist. So Carroll Reese was tasked with researching tax-exempt foundations and nonprofits. They said, go find out if these people are communists or what they're up to, do research. So he assembled a team. He had a couple of different lawyers and some assistants and a whole team of people dedicated just to do this. And it was called American Establishment, Tax-Exempt Foundations. The final report was authored by Carroll Reese and a congressman by the name of Norman Dodd. And the official title of this is called Hearings Before the Special Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations and Comparable Organizations. What they found was the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Endowment were using funds that they were sending to Columbia University, Harvard University, Chicago, and the University of California, as well as others, in order to enable what they called oligarchical collectivism. So what this means is these people studied these tax-exempt nonprofits, and they found that they actually had an agenda that, just like the General Education Board that said it was out there to promote education, but privately was saying, hey, we don't want to actually turn these people into being the next philosophers or doctors, we just want to keep them at a base level of education. As they started to research these various and seemingly disconnected groups, they realized they all were like kind of an interconnecting web. And some of the people wrote books about this. One of them, and I think this is on your sheet, was a lawyer by the name of Rene Wormser. He wrote a book called Foundations, Their Power and Influence that explains this whole thing. There's also another book that kind of touches on this that I actually recently found when we visited my grandmother. My grandmother's in her 80s, and when I started waking up and started talking to her, I realized she was very, very much awake and had been awake, before I ever was born and knew what was going on. But there was a book that was written in the 70s called None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. And it was written with a journalist and with some people from Congress that talk about the same thing. So once again, these are things that are not taught in school. That is a congressional committee funded by the U.S. government producing a report that says, hey, all of these nonprofits, or at least a large portion of them, are using their money and their funds to push people towards collectivism, towards more government control, towards basically all the things that we've been describing. And so this has been known about for some time. It's just this information rarely makes it public. I'm not going to tell you that this was a part of history. You have to go do the research for yourself. But that happens to this day. Right now, we're seeing that play out in our world. I'll also give you one more example before I move on. Before 9/11, there was an organization called Project for the New American Century. I'm sure some of you guys have heard that. They wrote a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And in this paper, the people who were involved in this institution said they were just sort of theoretically talking about what they would do if they were to go back to Iraq. If America was to go into Iraq, what would that play out like? And this is how these organizations operate a lot of times. They kind of just talk hypothetically, as if they have no power, right? And they said, well, if we went back to Iraq, this is what we would do, et cetera, all this kind of things. But one of the things they said was the American people are not likely to support another war with Iraq unless some catastrophe happens, and they use the word a new Pearl Harbor specifically. So they said that right before 9/11 happened, about a year before 9/11. And that might be some sort of coincidence, like, oh wow, these guys said that unless there's a new catastrophe, the American people aren't going to support going to war in Iraq. But then once you look at the institution and you look at who the people who wrote the paper, you find the name Donald Rumsfeld, who became Secretary of Defense during the Bush administration. You find the name Dick Cheney, who became Vice President during the Bush administration. Paul Wolfowitz, I can't remember his position, but also high up in the cabinet. Nearly every single person who wrote that paper saying, unless a new catastrophe happens, we're not going to be able to go back to Iraq. They got elected in 2000, and then 9/11 happened. I'm not saying they did it, but I'm definitely saying that these institutions do that a lot. These think tanks, they just write papers all the time. And most of us average people, we don't pay attention to this shit. I'm just kind of a nerd, so I'm always like looking for this, and other researchers are as well. Because if you study them and you pay attention to what they're talking about, you can pretty much predict the future, and you can see it coming, because that's how they do it. This is the way they signal to their other friends out there, this is the plan, this is what's going on. And all the while people think, oh, it's just a non-profit, it's just a think tank, it has no power, it's not important.